So I chose these two particular pieces of the collection not only because they were acquired the same year and in the same gallery in 2001, but also because they're probably like the two pieces of the collection that have been like the most exhibited for like some reason. So like talking again about, you know, like how like pieces circulate and get contextualized in different settings. So being obviously related, these two pieces, as you may see, Durant's piece is based on Robert Smithson's inverted tree. And of course there's the reference to the mirror underneath. So these pieces establish historical and discursive bridges and account for the echoes and repercussions between different interpretations, establishing continuities or ruptures between the different curatorial discourses that have framed them. These two works not only relate a major historical artist like Smithson to a contemporary one like Durant, but also link both artists to our local context with a more critical perspective. So you may know that Robert Smithson planted 3 reverse trees, one in the state of New York, the other in the state of Florida, and the third one in Yaxchilan, close to Yaxchilan in Chiapas, no, Yucatan. So we can, of course, also recall the piece Hotel Palenque that Smithson did in Chiapas, and of course, like the readings of entropic, like the whole entropic character of Mexican architecture and Mexican modernism that he did. And we could also recall, of course, you know, like the post-colonial readings that were done on Smithson's work. And that's something that Sam Durant also, of course, recovers and translates again to like the American context, but also can be translated to the like Mexican-American situation in the United States. So, based on this, we could do just like a very simple exercise in tracking, you know, like what has been the interaction between these two and how they have been displayed in the history of the collection. And so, basically, like both pieces have been exhibited in 10 different exhibitions. So I could go like through the titles of the shows. It would be, you know, like probably not super interesting, but just like to give you a sense of the different contexts in which they've been exhibited. So the first one was an exhibition called Eden, which was basically works like a thematic show with works that referred somehow to nature, like in very general terms. Another one was the uses of the images that dealt with photography. Another one was Los Angeles, Mexico, complexities and heterogeneities, so dealing with 2 different contexts. So again, just like this, just to show you, you know, like the very different ways in which a work can be framed. And of course, you know, like take into consideration, again, where it comes from and where it goes to. One of the shows in which, so these are just like, you know, different images of how the work was created, uncreated, installed, displayed, exhibited, and then moved just along for the last 10 years. But I think one of the most interesting contexts, at least for me, in which one of like Sam Durant's piece was shown, was actually at the Tamayo Museum in a show that Pablo León de la Barra created in 2012 probably, and that actually was a show that took place when just a tiny bit after Sofía left, and the show was called Incidents of Mirror Travel in Yucatan and Elsewhere. And in this case, we just had received a donation by Jonathan Monk of the piece Color Reversal Non-Site with Ensuite Bathroom from 2009, which was an inverted replica of the sign of Hotel Palenque. So I knew that Pablo León de la Barra had done this show in Guatemala based on not only Smithson's travels, but also like he went all the way back to Stephen Catherwood and all these expeditioners like that covered like a whole century. So basically, the exhibition existed in the space created by the echoes and reflections of the work of these three expeditioners and the subsequent genealogies of different travelers, archaeologists, and artists that followed their footsteps. And of course, it was like both the exhibition and many of the works were like a very direct reference to the work of Smithson. And just like to retake like the words of Smithson. He talked about his inverted tree himself as like the three, versions of the trees, as invisible lines drawn on the map that connect these trees and mark peripheral locations, poles that have slipped geographical strands of terrestrial axes, focal points that avoid being central. So basically, I think this is like a very interesting way of just like following the path of these three works that themselves wanted to decentralize a little bit the discourse of the mainstream discourse that was taken over by Sam Durat, that was taken over then by Pablo León de la Barra in a different context. So I think it's really a very, very small way, or like a very small example of how these pieces again can just travel in time, travel in context, and travel in different kind of discursive articulations, and just somehow signal, I think it's really important that we somehow at Jumex, it's not, of course, the case of the 2,800 works, but many of them, there's a non-Kawara. Actually, César also had one of those pieces that was also related to the Mexican context. That was in '68. So you have of course, the painting, and then the newspaper clip that actually refers to the students' revolt of the date. So somehow there's been an effort also to relate the collection to the local context and do some readings. So even though it's a collection that has been really expanding on contemporary international art and looking very specifically to the local context, it's been also trying to make all these bridges. So this is some images of a show that opened 2 weeks ago. You can see also in there the Smithson piece again. So that was a show, probably one more behind. Here it is, ahí está. So basically that was a show that was planned for the opening of the museum that for different reasons was, that had to be postponed. So it just opened a few weeks ago, and the original idea of this show, again, not very interesting in terms of context, but it was just basically to keep the space open and really establish some sort of dialogue with the architecture. So again, and if we move forward, bueno, that's the space being constructed. So we opened the new space, I think 4 months ago, last November. Those are some images of the whole process of installation, again, of a show that I co-curated with Peter Lee of James Lee Byers' work. And so there you can see, I think it's again, talking about displacement and how the works travel. I think this case was also really interesting. Just the work itself, I don't know if you're familiar with Byers' work, but the exhibition was very much focused on his performative practice. And of course, that was the work he did probably between mid 50s, late 50s, up to the 80s. And there's very little, documentation that remains. There's lots of ephemera, there's some videos, there's some letters. But basically, I think one of the most interesting parts of that show, and one of the most, or the bigger challenges of that show, was precisely, how to represent or present again the work of an artist that is gone. And when we consider that his practice was so much based on his persona. So he would do like all these performances. So now that he's not there, like now that he's not present, how can you make it present again? And so we decided to use, like lots of ephemera. Some of the works that were in the center, for example, were one of the very early works, performative objects that he presented in MoMA in 1958. And then he decided to donate them anonymously. And basically the works remained there in the storage until now, like for 50 years. So I think it's also like a very interesting thing, like in that sense, like on, again, how ideas somehow travel and how, like collections travel, like basically, like probably more based on ideas again than like the physical travel of the work.
Thank you, Magalí, very much. We're going to move on to Cesar's presentation. And just as a mode of introduction and to have some things in mind to connect some of what we're going to listen right now with Cesar is that the Robert Smithson-Sam Durant exchange, meaning Sam Durant, an artist that has reflected on the practice of Robert Smithson, and that these two artworks are in one artist wants to be in dialogue with another artist, but that the collection decides to have two artworks of presenting that dialogue and how much that dialogue has consistently emerged and re-emerged in all number of exhibitions in different contexts is something that I think is worth noting as it pertains to the very new move from the collection of César Cervantes, who has been known primarily internationally in regards to his contribution for being one of the key collectors in Mexico that grew and accompanied the emergence of an art scene in Mexico City in particular, not in the entire country for sure, but Mexico City is like a country in and of itself. So his collecting practice is primarily identified with being a partner in fun and crime in the making of an art scene that is very much representative of his collection, and that now has entered into a process that Cesar will describe, that for political purposes, diplomatic, we will call it deaccessioning, is put it in circulation again to be able to enter into a dialogue, very much in the case of Sam Durant with Smithson, meaning someone of our present revising the work of someone from the past, in this case Barragán. So César, if you can please, y aquí está esto por si lo quieres hacer automáticamente. If we could put the slideshow of César Cervantes, that would be great, and we could do it automatically.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Sorry, my English will not be so good as Magali's or Sofia's. I'm pleased to be with Sofía and Magalí, both persons who really inspired me while collecting, so as they're people they work for. I will say, to make it simple and more direct, that I might be a collector in retirement. I think my process as a collector just finished, at least for contemporary art. I might be collecting some other things, but I will say contemporary art is finito. We might say collecting is something, we were just discussing last night that collecting might be something genetic or still genetic for human beings, but as long as contemporary art for me, I think it's finished. I'm happy with that. For many years I was questioning where should the collection go, or should collectors must have a limit or an end to the project, as writers do, or movie directors do, or any other kind of collectors. So after probably 15 years actively collecting, very involved, for the last 2 years I was feeling that something was not going well with me, with contemporary art, with the market, with artists, with, I will say, with collecting. What was the purpose of collecting? How much should I collect? Was it a money issue or just an ego issue? Or I had so many questions. Many of them are there. You will see the phrases that had, or the quotes that had inspired me and my decision to stop collecting. While I was thinking about stopping or stop collecting, my interest in architecture came back. I had always had an interest in architecture, in history, in many things. By the way, I must say I bought my first painting while I was still in college. I was like 21 years old, and I bought my first painting. It took me like 5 years to finish painting that painting. But then I got interested in architecture, and I bought this house in the area where I had lived for 35 years, and developed both. Developed the refurbishing or the renovation of the house together with the collection, which I kept building until a few months ago. And as I decided to stop this process a few months ago, it came to my mind the idea of buying a Luis Barragan house. Luis Barragan is, I will say, the most famous Mexican architect and one of the top architects in the world for last century. He didn't build more than 20 houses, of which probably 15 are still extant. Most of them are quite altered, and I actually try, like Jumex and many other collectors, to buy this house, but it didn't work. And then I decided to swap my collection for the house, kind of. Probably I needed the money, but also I thought it was the moment to change and the reason to change. So I stopped collecting. I am selling most of my collection, but at the same time buying the house. And I think I will just leave it like this, and if there's something interesting we can discuss on this, I will feel more comfortable discussing it, or I'm more into answering questions because my life now, it's all about answering questions. I have no clear mind. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know exactly why I'm just quitting collecting. I know how critical I can be about it now, but it's better if we open a dialogue, if you think so, Sofía, okay? Thank you.
I think that I want to go back to the comment that I pointed out in terms of the weight that I'm going to call it the weight, el peso, and not call it a trend as a kind of a strategy or a way of working. I call it the weight that it seems that our generation has been feeling about the importance of revising history. And I think that many of the decisions that at least we share between us and also amongst many other curators that form collections or programming or collectors that form collections is a necessity to revise history, to recuperate it, to unearth it, to retell it. And that if we can very well see how an artist like Sam Durant does that to reconsider the work of Smithson as it was developed during a student movement, and for a curator to decide to then put these works together to once again emphasize the way in which a student movement was also negated and that it might as well be done. My thinking is that that happens in different guises, and I find that that in the case of César's going to acquire a home of an architect that has not been forgotten. On the contrary, he's he's significantly known, but still to relinquish the contemporary, meaning one's production in our present time, to be able to recover or to inhabit or to unearth something from the past, as it is the collection of a home that existed and its renovation at present. I want to see what this means for our generation. In the case of the collection that I work with, our main responsibility has been to make publicly known the contributions, whether artistic and cultural, that have been provided by Latin American thinkers and artists and that have not necessarily been acknowledged internationally. So the collection is based on that historical revisionism that needs to not only be unearthed but also to be promoted, and collecting is part of that very practice, no? To not just let it go away and have no history. It is only through collecting and through writing that history and then through putting it in circulation again that could be acknowledged as other developments. So I wanted for you both to think and to respond to that question of like, what is this weight, and in what ways are we becoming privately or publicly responsible for the revision of a history, and how that curatorially or in terms of collecting, how does that relate to your own practice, other than say through acquisitions or interpretation?
I would say, well, I should first say that I've just been working for like the last 2 years at the Jumex Foundation. And so that, and as I was saying, that's a collection that started in the late 90s. And so basically like I can have like both, like two different takes on whatever the role of the collection is now. One would be like some sort of, I have like a retrospective kind of gaze on how the collection was formed. When I wasn't involved into that, I had like that kind of distance, which is like, that would be like one thing. And then of course now I have like a completely different take now that I'm involved into that, and that we have this new space, as I was saying in the first place, because now we have to look into the future. So I think that when, like I used to work at the Carrillo Hill Museum, which is a tiny museum, in the late 90s, and actually that was the first time that the Jumex collection was shown, publicly shown. And it was, at that time, it was still like very private, so we basically just made like a very basic selection, as many of those that we just said, you know, like just like a selection of works that were displayed. And basically that was, probably remember that the first time that the Eugenius collection like went public, or went, you know, like became part of a social. Then it just like got like more and more involved into the local art scene. And I think that there were like two things. One was really, that was really one of the first times, I guess, that we had the chance to really be confronted to international contemporary art. You know, like Mexico in the 80s and 90s was like still very, very much closer to itself. There were like all these like economical crises, so it wasn't that easy. So he, like Eugenio Lopez was one of the first people to start building on a collection, like an international collection, but at the same time he was smart enough to start buying like contemporary artists that were very young. At that time we're talking about Damian Ortega, Francis Alice, like, you know, like all that generation. Actually, like probably like before him there were some other collectors, like much smaller and more private. But I think one of the most important things that was that he basically like sort of systematized the practice of collecting with a very kind of philanthropic gaze. So it was not just about collecting again and accumulating works, but also he started like this whole like project of grants, sponsorship for different institutions. And as I was saying before, that was like really, I think, what, you know, like started changing the way the Mexican art scene operated. Not only, you know, like paying for many of us to study abroad. That was like a huge, I think, like a huge improvement, you know, like to the way the whole art scene was working, just in terms of, you know, like professionalization of like the people that were involved, both artists and curators and critics. And then, of course, you know, like all the institutions were like actually funded in such a way that we could establish different kind of relationships with other parts of the world, like different kind of shows, being exposed to different things. So I guess in that way, you know, like he was like really looking forward to a future. And then now that we are in the future, you know, like now that it happened and he made it happen somehow. And I'm being, you know, like, I'm just talking about him, but I guess at that point, you know, like, many people like you followed, you know, like behind them, and you're basically the same generation, no? So now that we're in the future, like I think the collection had a very basic or simplistic way of operating, which was, just like inviting curators from abroad to do a selection of works of the collection, and then that would make a show, which meant usually like a thematic exhibition, a collective show, which of course is a very limited format in terms of curating. So now what we're trying to do is we're actually like reversing the way they were operating before, which was, like it's not that the curatorial program is following the acquisition program, but the other way around. We're trying to make the acquisitions follow a specific curatorial program. So in the case of James Lee Byers, for example, we acquired 2 pieces specifically for the show, and then we built a show around it. We did the same for Guido Cointet before that, and that's been a way also of integrating some of the artists that we're interested in into the collection instead of the other way around. Some people that we thought that needed to be represented, we're just like putting them in there. So that's also like a way of, of course the collection goes much faster than that, and the acquisitions go much faster than the curatorial program. But at least we're trying to, articulate something in there.
So maybe you can try to address a bit that question, and also along the way respond or make a comment around the quotations that you have in your presentation, because we understand that the photographs are images of the earlier collection at home, How to Live with Art, but the quotes go between abandoning art and being fascinated by it. So maybe you could talk a little bit in your response of the weight of history with your sense of abandonment, or the very practice of collecting.
I think there's some extraordinary people like the ones like Eugenio Lopez or Patricia Cisneros. I think collecting is a need, and it's wonderful, and I praise Eugenio and Patricia on their collecting. I think it must be done. But then there's a big, big difference between people like they two with the rest. No, I think in Mexico there will be no more, hopefully more than 2 or 3 Eugenio Lopez. There's no one. It's hard to compete with that. It's impossible to get to what they are doing. So as Patricia, I don't think it's feasible. I don't think it is needed. I see too many collectors in Mexico trying to do the same and just accumulating for the purpose of accumulating, trying to compete, I don't know against what or who, but I for many years I saw that obsession in just accumulating, and the more they accumulate, the more the path was lost or the focus was lost. Even Jumex had a crisis on accumulating. Some 5 years ago, they were just buying whatever was happening there. But personally, I thought, I was feeling like a middle-class collector, and it was very uncomfortable. I found myself just buying art or trying to accumulate. And then the moment I was storing more art, the more questions arose. What was the purpose of just storing art in a storage room? I think probably you can sense from the quotes, these quotes are quotes that for the last 15 years I keep adding. I might add one a week. Last night, as I was seeing Piero Magnifici in the exhibition, I wrote a couple quotes. And as I was seeing that exhibition, I was more happy with what I was doing, with my decision of just stop collecting. I felt so good. It was one of those exhibitions I felt really good because I had no anxiety. It was one of the first times I was in a museum exhibition with no real anxiety or frustration of not having or not being able to have one of those works. By the way, the last work that was added to the collection was a Piero Manzoni Merda de Artista, and I only had it for like a couple of weeks because it was one of the first works that was sold. The moment I announced that I was selling the collection, that work was immediately sold. But I have too many things to say probably, but I think we must live with art. I think art is very important, not that we need to neglect art. I'm just questioning collecting. The new house I will live, and probably the new life I will live, it will have art, of course. I'm already looking for the art that might be in this time of my life, in this new house or this house I will live in. But I think I will never go back to accumulating more than what is needed.
But like we were having this conversation last night, and you mentioned at some point like the possibility of collecting houses. So how do you like perceive one thing in relation or opposition to the other? Of course, it's like much easier probably to buy art than buy houses, but...
Well, no, it's not that I will collect houses. There's a few house collectors or architecture collectors. I have a strong commitment with the area I live, which is this urban development that Luis Barragan did. It changed the story of Mexico's city architecture or urbanism. It influenced many other areas in the world. I just want to, with buying this house, that there might be some images there, but with acquiring this house, I just wanted to call attention of friends of mine, people I know, people that are collecting art, to some other instances, to some other things, like it could be houses or historical architecture. If I end up buying 2 or 3 houses, it will only be to put them back into life, to stop being demolished. This historical house, I don't know if there are images of it there, but this historical house, if we haven't bought it late last year, it will by now be transformed into a hotel. So it was the end of that house, which is a historical house. So I feel like doing that. I feel like buying 2 or 3 houses because I cannot, and that's a dream. But I could never think about buying more than that. I just call attention to them, and if I sell them, I will sell them. It's like the house you knew, the one you see in the images. It was also 20 years ago, it was an abandoned house about to be demolished. And we bought it, we restored it, and we brought attention to that kind of architecture, which until then was mostly neglected in Mexico. Many of these kind of houses built in the 60s were being demolished. And now they are being preserved, or at least they have more attention to them. So I don't feel I will never collect houses. I feel that, I don't feel like collecting. I love books. I will always be involved in books. But I don't think having a library means collecting books. So I don't know if I will ever collect something else.
But in your own collecting practice, you accompanied the artists that were your contemporaries and formed a collection as they were forming the work, with some instances of buying historic artworks from other countries, from other generations, and so on. But ultimately, the strength of your collection was living with and working with your contemporaries. How is it that you decide to collect a house that's already historical, instead of, say, commissioning a house to one of your contemporaries?
First thing, in order to understand our present or to try to think about our future, is to understand our past. And in countries like Mexico, we tend to forget about our past immediately. You both know that when I start collecting, I start historically. The average year of production of my collection until last year, it was 1977. That was the average date of creation for the works in the collection, and it was around 800 works. So this average tells you that there was a real interest in history. There were many works, even Goya, Francisco de Goya. I bought some prints a few years ago because that's where my interest started. I think contemporary art started with Goya. So I had always had an interest in history. I did this, as you know, as you said, with my contemporaries, and I was very happy to do so. but then they just simply start running faster than I could run, so couldn't catch up with them and start feeling lost. And that was one of the reasons that took me to this decision. I think I wrote the quote there that we should not trust artists with more than one assistant. And I still think that's a maxima. If you are about to buy some artworks, you should ask how many assistants does that artist has. If we go to the masters, I don't see more than one assistant ever. And now my friends or the artists we are putting our attention to, they have, what? An average of 5, we will say. And I don't like that. I don't want to say that's wrong or right, but I just simply don't like that. I like Duchamp, I like Manzoni, I like David Lamelas, who was here. I like these people who do their work, are more involved. Probably, when you get so close to something or someone that you get to know it so well, then you might be disappointed, and it happened to me. I was really close to some artists, critics, curators, that the moment to be disappointed just came by. When I was seeing these friends validating works through the computer, just saying, yes, send that to the fair. How's that? You didn't do the work, you never saw the work physically, and you decide that work must go to an art fair? Yes. So that really disappointed me in a way. I don't want to be so romantic, but it did disappointed me. I don't believe in that. I think time is a quality issue, and as collectors, the best ally for a good collection is time. The more time you take, the better your collection might be. The more time you take reading a book, the more you will enjoy that book.
Okay, so with that note, in regards to time, I don't know if someone in the public has questions that we could ask the presenters. And if there's no raising of hand, I would like to ask one more question. And basically, are there any questions from the audience? One of the things that I speak to other people that work in collections, whether it's because they are private collectors themselves or curators of private collections that work very closely with the collectors, the patrons that they represent, is that when you are acquiring of your contemporaries and when you are acquiring work when they are so-called emerging artists, when their trajectories begin, it sometimes takes 2-3 years, it sometimes takes 5 to 10 years in which the artworks actually have prices that are extraordinary from how one builds. And the question, or the comments that some of them have given, particularly a friend collector from Paris, was that she actually had to put a financial goal for the first time. ¿Cómo se dice? Financial limits. A financial limit. And she says, you notice that while the objective was to accompany these artists in the development of their careers and their trajectories to be able to continue acquiring throughout the years, there's a point in which you can't no longer because the prices are just too high. And the question is, what do you do? What do you do if you indeed want to have a continuation with that artist? How are the ways in which you accompany them based on the fact of the prices? And now that you mention, you made a metaphor that for me the picture was being in a schoolyard in recess in elementary school, that you say they ran faster than I did, which means that that's a way of speaking. The prices were higher than the purchases that I could make, no? But it's an experience that happens in life, not only in regards to acquisitions, but just in life in general, in regards to trajectories. How do we grow with people? How does one understand growth ultimately? How does one not exactly stay behind, but choose to be in a place that may look behind from their viewpoint, those that ran, but from one's viewpoint perhaps is a decision of where we want to be. So my questions to you is, how We've been working 15, 20 years now, since we were younger, late teenagers, working passionately in the arts. And during this time, we see that those trajectories of some of our peers have skyrocketed, and that means prices and acquisitions. How are the ways in which one can address this? And I'll give you some of my I'll give you some of the ways in which I think about it right now. Is certainly deaccessioning. Deaccessioning not the works of those artists that I would like to continue following, but perhaps some of those artists that prices are very high, but they're not necessarily the ones that I would like to accompany throughout a longer period. So deaccessioning is an idea. I'm just throwing it out as an idea. And there's other ways. Donating to collections of public museums that may be able to collectively, through committees, continue acquiring the work, meaning uniting forces with other people so that they would become co-responsible in following the trajectories of one or another artist. That's a second possibility. You know, there's various ways in which I think it's not the end-all, be-all, but that one would have to diversify one's very responsibility or engage others in the fantasy and the desire and the willpower to continue, say, accompanying such and such artist and deciding to leave such and such. You seem very determined to answer, so I will I will pass you the microphone now. But I would also like to hear from Magalí.
I don't know the. Like, there's so many questions in your questions. I will simply say, you know, life, society we tend to live in smaller spaces. That's a fact all over the world. Houses are becoming smaller. We tend to have less time. Everything is going on the contrary of collecting. The moment we moved into a new house, it tends to be smaller, or the space is becoming smaller. So accumulating, again, these objects, for me, not for institutions like you are, it goes against reason. Then my other point will be prices. As you mentioned, there's no other commodity or no other profession that increases their value or the price as fast as art or an artist do. It's incredible how there's no other commodity or no other profession. I mean, if you move from one work to the other, you might do so because you got, after 10 years, 10 or 20% increase. Whereas an artist, after a show, a museum show, his prices go 30, 40, 50% increase that year. And probably next year will be the same. So that's not an answer, but those are things that came to my mind as I was listening to you. But my position is very different from an institution.
I would say, you know, and we just went through the process of an expansion, which means, obviously, as I was saying before, you know, like the collection was before like housed in the middle of the factory. Even though it was public, it wasn't really public because people wouldn't access it. So, like, again, expanding means probably that we have like too many works. So we're buying probably like too much. And I say we, but I don't do the buying that much. You know, I'm more like curating. So that's probably also, you know, like a way of accounting on what I'm going to say. But like, I would also say, you know, like we totally need to slow down, even though we've been through this phase of expansion, which means, and speaking as a curator, you know, like I think that obviously the format that was being followed before of just like doing, you know, like exhibiting the collection was completely exhausted. And I should probably not be saying this because, of course, if you have a collection, it's pretty much because you have to show it. Or otherwise it would just be, you know, like accumulating it and just like, as you were saying, put it into storage. But of course, you know, like if we want to, again, as a curator, if we want to really build a program, if we really want to build a discourse around the works that are there or between the works, or, you know, like, again, you know, like how do you articulate all that content? How do you give it context? You know, like it's not, totally don't believe that it's by doing like a thematic exhibition on nature you would give any context either to Sam Durant, either to Smithson or anyone else, because it comes from a very, very kind of different context. So I think we really, like again, we really need to slow down. We really need to think about like things and works, and like of course that takes time, and we really need to slow down. Like just takes time to reflect on the works. It takes time to just like build an exhibition. It takes like everything takes time if you want to write like a proper essay. So it's not about just like again showing and displaying but like I don't know. Ironically, like I totally feel that things are somehow leading to the other side. So like that's that.
Let me add something like this last exhibition at Jumex Museum that Magalí was showing, which was supposed to be the opening. As far as I know, it shows no more than 1% of the works in the collection, which was to be the opening, and now it's the second show, of a collector who is 45. And so far, now that he had opened his museum, which you can imagine how many millions was that, his opening exhibition didn't get to show not even 1% of his own collection. So in all of his life, he won't get to see all of his collection exhibited at his own museum. Sounds really strange to me.
It doesn't sound strange to me. I think that there are differences between collections, and I think that Museo Jumex, Colección Jumex, does something that hadn't happened in the country before, which is there had been no building of collections of art and artifacts, nor sponsorship in such a strong way in the last 30 years. So that a private individual chooses to collect for reasons that are personal, but that in the process, precisely because of the excess, that enters into a system of so-called professionalization, creating teams, creating storages, creating, an interest of institution, to be able to open it to the public is not exactly a natural cause, but it's a cultural prerogative. So he has taken the responsibilities for whatever reasons, whether it was like, will or a public demand, he has taken the responsibilities that the state could not take. And that all these contemporary production and contributions would only be bought by international museums and collectors and leave the country without us in Mexico having any collection to go back to, as we have it from our antepasados. How do you say that? Antecessors? ¿Cómo se dice antepasados? Ancestors. I think it's a shame. And okay, we can't tell the state, why didn't you buy it? Because you've been doing it for centuries, or for over a century, building these museums. But I do think that we would come to look at our own peers and say, how come we didn't organize ourselves to record our history and to be able to become responsible for sharing it with other cultures and other generations? So that part of it is in storage, no problem. I have no problem. Because I prefer that it's in storage in Mexico than somewhere in Switzerland, by the way.
And it's actually
or somewhere in Italy here, or in just in the United States, because they had the money. So
but your collection actually has been doing great without the space also, which is like your like.
Yes, we don't have a space,
which
and
is like
yes,
really
we have
interesting
many storages. But part of my responsibilities, as it is the part of the team, is doing research, expanding the collection, and certainly discussing the work with other researchers and curators so that they can consider it on loan or for donation or for long-term exhibitions at their own institutions, with the goal that we have a body of work that, if integrated into other collections, in terms of narrative, because of a curatorial museografía, or because of an existing collection, we can actually contribute once again to the more global reading of our culture and of our times. So yes, I don't have a problem that some of the works are in storage as long as it circulates, and hence the reason for organizing a conversation of that is that seen as a faux pas to do deaccessioning, but sometimes it is necessary. It's seen as meaning as a kind of lack of responsibility, and so on. For me, the ways in which collections circulate that is natural. They have to circulate, discursively through exhibitions. Sometimes they enter back in the market to be able to acquire other things and so on. To me, the critical discussions is that they do not circulate. When they are not shared publicly, when there is no knowledge being generated from that, nor experiences that can become ultimately public. I think that my focus is also always to try to think of the transition that a collector can make into philanthropy, meaning when there is not only just an interest for the artist's trajectory and for the work and to experience that, but also to be able to gift that experience by sharing it publicly, by sharing it with others. Doesn't mean to give a lot of money here or there, although that's always welcomed and very good. It also means allowing others to possibly have a similar, perhaps even better experience that you have with what you own.